climate change, the events that we have today are only happening because industry, or maybe not only, but are happening partially because industry failed to act back in the 50s when Geoff highlights that industry knew, right? In those moments, if they started to say, oof, like this is not a product that we can morally sell, and started to phase out, then the world that we look in would look very different. So it's not as simple as saying, okay, what percentage of these impacts are caused from your carbon produced? There's also the impacts of how the world might have looked differently if you didn't have all this greenwashing, if you weren't producing this obstruction of the science, if you weren't putting out all these campaigns to create disinformation and prevent policies from happening. So those all need to start to be factored in into that conversation as well.
Hello, and a warm welcome to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, the Executive Director, and today we're going to examine one of the most volatile, pressing issues confronting us at this time: climate change and the survival of the planet. Today, New Zealand is dealing with yet another cyclone and has declared a state of emergency. These climatic disasters are becoming such everyday events, we lose track of the names of the hurricanes and the dates. But to fully understand how we got into this pitiful predicament, we really need to rewind the clock and look back at events to see what we now know for certain. Thanks to the diligent work of Harvard researchers like Jeffrey Supin and Naomi Oreskes, whose recent science paper was picked up by the world media, to quote Supin, "We now have airtight, unimpeachable evidence that ExxonMobil accurately predicted global warming years before it turned around, publicly attacked climate science and scientists. Its public denial contradicted its own scientists' data." But of course, we knew this decades before. Back in 1959, renowned physicist Edward Teller warned oil executives about the dangerous impact that fossil fuels would have on global temperatures, citing melting ice caps, rising oceans, and large-scale environmental destruction. His speech was followed by ExxonMobil's own scientific data in the 70s, which shows their projections of global temperature increases matched what has actually occurred with remarkable accuracy. I think we've got a still of the graph actually showing that very, very clearly, their projection from the 1900s and what actually has occurred. Quite stark. We're also posting for anybody online there, the science paper that the two researchers at Harvard wrote, and a New York Times piece about the findings, and also Ben Franter's piece in The Guardian, which was 5 years ago. Well, it's all very depressing since it demonstrates ever so clearly that ExxonMobil knew knew all this and how we could have avoided the predicament we find ourselves now in. Well, to help us try and rewind the clock and look at the labyrinth of lies, cover-ups, and misinformation that took place, we're going to talk to journalist Geoff Dembicki, and then we will consider the legal options that are being pursued to prosecute the oil companies who have spent millions of dollars trying to convince people that the climate emergency wasn't real. Well, we have three very capable experts in their fields. Geoff is an investigative climate change journalist who now lives in Brooklyn. He's written a remarkable account of this blighted period of history entitled The Petroleum Papers: Inside the Far-Right Conspiracy to Cover Up Climate Change. And he will be joined by Alyssa Johl, VP for Legal for the Center for Climate Integrity, and Dr. Delta Merner, who's a lead scientist for climate litigation at the Union of Concerned Scientists. So welcome to all three of you. Okay, Geoff, let's start with you. Can you paint us a little picture about your own history growing up in Alberta, Canada, surrounded by oil refineries? You said you had a childhood, quote, immersed in oil, and how that morphed into a deep distrust of the oil industry after you found out about the Koch brothers and their dirty money.
Yeah, so I grew up in a city called Edmonton, which is in the province of Alberta in Canada. And Alberta is home to the Canadian tar sands, also known as the oil sands, which are one of the largest oil reserves on the entire planet. And so from an early age, I really was, surrounded by oil quite literally. The playground that I played at as a kid, it was built underneath an oil refinery owned by an Exxon subsidiary. So I remember being on the monkey bars as a 7-year-old with my brother, looking up at the edge of the ravine and seeing a refinery stack with giant flames shooting out the top of it. And so, as I got older, friends worked in the industry, family members. We would go to hockey games, and the local hockey team was even named the Edmonton Oilers. And so oil was really just, inescapable. And it wasn't until much later in my life that I began to take a more critical perspective on this industry I'd grown up in. It started with me deciding to become an environmental journalist. And then a decade or so ago, I really learned for the first time the extent to which companies like Exxon and Koch Industries had deliberately spread lies about climate change in order to confuse the public and make them think that the emergency wasn't real. And when I looked further into it, I was very disturbed to learn that these two companies were directly connected to not only my home province, my home city, but to those refineries I remember seeing as a kid. That one refinery with the monkey bars underneath it is owned by Exxon, which is one of the biggest purveyors of climate disinformation in history. And I later learned that Koch Industries, who funded an equally widespread and nefarious effort to confuse the public, owns a refinery in Minnesota that's one of the biggest refiners of Canadian tar sands oil. And so, for myself, I realized that this industry that had sustained me was helping fund this massive effort to slow down solutions to this existential crisis we face as a human species. And so after that, I vowed to sort of go as deep as I could into learning about the source of this disinformation campaign, how it had affected the public, and who is funding it.
So the book is a kind of a roller coaster historically of positive surges of progress where climate change was concerned, depending on who was in the administration. And then there was periods of intense negativity that seemed to thwart and undo any good that had been just established. So it was a very erratic kind of cycle of it's not progress experience. I was thinking about back even to things like BP. First, they acknowledged that they were involved. And then in the 90s, well, maybe you should tell people, after Edward Teller did the speech, so that was the first time he mentioned things like greenhouse gases having this terribly detrimental effect. So then their research is done by the industry itself, and it pretty much has this terrible prognosis. So for people that maybe don't know, what actually happens then? In terms of hiring PR consultants and burying the science and changing the science and saying it's reckless and it can't be trusted. And I'll let you explain.
Yeah, so in the writing of this book, there had been really amazing investigative journalism already out there done by outlets like Inside Climate News and the Los Angeles Times, showing that Exxon had studied climate change as far back as the late 60s and 70s, and then intentionally spread lies about that science in outlets like the New York Times. And so I really wanted to go back as far as I could and find the first instances of the industry being warned about climate change. And the earliest date that I could pinpoint was that event you mentioned that took place in 1959 when Edward Teller, who was one of the inventors of the atomic bomb, warned a room full of oil executives that the products they pulled from the ground, when burned, are heating up the atmosphere and could someday flood the world's coastal cities. So this was decades and decades ago. One of the executives at that original meeting in 1959, Robert Dunlap, head of a company called Sun Oil. And 4 years later, he was up in northern Alberta helping set up the first commercial tar sands operation, which really allowed this industry to become one of the biggest oil industries on the entire planet. And so in writing the book, I also wanted readers to just to fully grasp how many opportunities we've had as a society to deal with climate change in a big transformative way. And how those opportunities have been deliberately blocked by the oil and gas industry. And one really dramatic example of that I want to flag is this document that I was looking at from the early 90s, and it was produced by Imperial Oil, the company that owned that refinery I used to play under. In the document, Imperial, which is owned by Exxon, studied ways in which we could fix the climate emergency. And so you have to remember, this is like the early 90s. The public is just waking up to climate change for the first time. James Hansen had testified about it to Congress only a few years earlier. And here you have one of the biggest oil companies on the planet figuring out like how do we get this thing under control? That's how far advanced Exxon was in its understanding of the issue. And so in this document I looked at, the company concluded that if there was a national price on all the emissions released by heavy industry across a country, this could stabilize greenhouse gas emissions, and then they would begin to decline. Not only that, but it could potentially be good for the economy because governments would have so much revenue from taxing carbon, they could fund a massive green stimulus that would create all sorts of new jobs and industries. And so Exxon...
Is this the national carbon price that you're talking about?
Yeah, this is a national carbon price, and Exxon is studying this in the early 90s. So it has this blueprint for fixing climate change and doing it in a way that wouldn't be bad for the economy, that would be good for the economy. But in the same document, the company lays out talking points for executives at the Canadian and American arms of the company, instructing those executives how to misrepresent this internal research on solutions to people in media and government, to frame fixing climate change as economically reckless and having uncertain benefit for the environment. And so that's just mind-blowing to me, to know we could have gotten this thing under control decades and decades ago.
So they hire people like PR specialists, some of the people that were used for the tobacco industry, the same people. They bring in kind of snake oil scientists that aren't even knowledgeable about climate science to diss the science that exists or say it's suspect or it's not certain. So they throw it into discontent and they push the emphasis, as you said before, to us, we the consumers, it's our fault kind of thing. We should be consuming less, we should be being more green, which is a very clever tactic. The person producing the product isn't the problem. The person consuming the product is. So it's actually very clever. Which brings me up to the latest kind of scenario of duping, which is the Ukraine situation we find ourselves in now. So in the last 12 months, the Ukraine war, we've been told there's these awful problems with oil supply, terrible shortages and price hikes in Europe, in UK, I know for a fact. And yet we discovered that recently Shell has just published that they had record profits and they doubled both Exxon and ExxonMobil and Shell both doubled their profits in 2022 and from 2021. And it was the highest ever. So it was 42 billion for Shell, and I think it was 40 billion for Exxon. So here we have this latest dupe. We're paying more and there's no shortage. So I don't know what you think about that. You said that this was a kind of a hoax, this scarcity propaganda.
Well, I look at these massive record-breaking profits from oil companies, in the context of many of these same companies saying as recently as 6 months or a year ago that they were committed to fixing climate change and achieving net zero in their operations. And if these companies were serious about actually doing that and actually cared about getting the climate emergency under control, rather than growing their own profits and the markets they can sell into, then they would be taking those record revenues and investing them in the types of technologies we need to get the climate emergency under control. But those companies are not doing that. Shell is cutting funding for its renewables division while doubling down on gas. BP is slowing down a wind down of oil and gas production that it had promised. Exxon is stepping back from its algae biofuels research. And in Canada, the top 6 tar sands producers, which have also promised to achieve net zero, they're now saying that they can't afford a climate transition on their own. They need governments to help them out. And you have to remember, like just a few years ago when the pandemic first hit, all of these same companies were begging governments to lay off on climate regulations because they said that it was impossible to afford those sorts of things. And now we have them raking in more money than at any other point in history, and they're stepping back. And so I think that tells you that ultimately these companies are bad faith players in dealing with climate change. And ultimately they need to be held responsible through the courts or through government action, which is what they've fought for decades and decades.
Well, that brings us very nicely to segue over to the legal science and legal team here. So, Alyssa, let's go to you first. Right. What is the role of the Centre for Climate Integrity, and why was it formed?
Well, thanks, Mary. Well, the organization was formed back in 2017, and we, as I like to say, that we have a very laser-focused mission. We are working with communities across the country and helping them in various ways to hold the oil and gas companies accountable for their role in the climate crisis. Sort of our mantra and something that I think builds on the work that Jeffrey and Naomi Oreskes and Jeffrey Supran and others have done. We like to say in our work that, you know, the industry and the fossil fuel majors had longstanding knowledge and knew about the causes and consequences of their product of climate change. And rather than disclose and, you know, that information and change their business model to address the harms that they knew that they were going to face, they doubled down and they lied and deceived and sold a product to all of us that they knew was going to cause harm. And for that, they should be held accountable. So they knew, they lied, and now they're facing their day in court. I will say that we aren't litigators. We are lawyers. We provide legal support in various ways. We support through amicus briefs and other means, but we're not actively litigating the cases. You know, I see our role as really to help educate policymakers, elected officials, community members about their legal and legislative options, and advocate for holding these polluters accountable.
So maybe you could bring us a little bit up to speed. I think there's several state attorney generals right now that have lawsuits against major oil companies, and I think Massachusetts and Rhode Island are right out front. So how does litigation like this proceed, and what are the grounds that you look to first? Is it well, I'll let you answer the question.
Sure. Well, this most recent wave of litigation, which started in about the time that our organization was filed in 2017, since that moment in time, there are 7 states in the District of Columbia, I believe 34 municipalities now with the Puerto Rican communities that have now filed suit, and 1 industry trade association out on the West Coast have all brought these what we refer to as climate liability lawsuits against the fossil fuel majors. They are, proceeding, by and large, they've been brought in state court under state law, and they are at varying stages, moving through the court systems. Like you said, that there are a few front runners. I'm not 100% sure on the status of Rhode Island, but I do know that Massachusetts and Honolulu are front runners. They are both actively in pretrial discovery right now, and that they will be moving towards trial. There are other cases that are a little bit further behind in the process, and others that are being held up on appeal. But all this to say is that five appellate courts, federal appellate courts, have now, considered and addressed this one procedural issue that's really been holding up and been a major delay tactic on the part of the industry, where these cases are filed in state court, then removed to federal court, where they then have to litigate which court has the appropriate jurisdiction. But 5 appellate courts have said that these cases can and should proceed in state court. So we're in a good position, and all signs, indicate that they will. This case is now on appeal before the Supreme Court. But again, there's no circuit split. There's no reason for the Supreme Court to take the case, but it has been raised before them.
So is the first stage getting them to admit their liability in lying and covering up the truth, or is it the next stage, which is the consequences of that inaction?
I think, it's at the point that they admit liability, I think that will be an absolute coup and victory for the plaintiffs. I have a hard, they are going to fight every step of the way to prevent these cases from going to trial. And that's what we've seen thus far. They are very fearful of what happens when these cases go to discovery and what will come out of the woodwork. Already, Jeffrey has written, a book on the topic, but there's more to come. And I think that, these cases will reveal with even greater precision what they knew, what and when, and what they did with that information back in the 80s, 90s, and to the present day.
There's a lot of waffling goes on with the oil companies when they're asked to testify. I remember watching one where, the scientists that actually took part on the ship said, we did really good science.
Right.
And, and I'm not surprised that is this accurate. And then the guy that's now the present CEO, or I think it was the CEO of Exxon, said, oh, we always worked with the best intentions. They come out with these amorphous platitudes that don't mean anything at all. So I worry that they'll pass the buck and say, oh, well, I wasn't in control at that time, I can't speak to it. But anyway, I'm sure you've got the documentation.
That's where the internal industry documents, of which there are, thousands of pages of documents that really tell this story of deception and denial. And, the fact that the industry was really at the cutting edge, they were, at the forefront of climate science back in the early 80s or so, mid 80s. And then they decided, this was a threat to their bottom line, and the tables turned. And that was the point at which they, the UNFCCC came into play. There was, considerations of regulation of greenhouse gases, not just at the national level, but also at the international level. And they did everything in their power to shut it down. And that essentially changed the trajectory of history and where we are today.
I'm just thinking about the lawyer whose name escapes me that was under house arrest for almost a year in New York City.
Stephen Donziger. Yeah.
Right. Just because they've got, impossibly deep pockets. And every time the man went to speak in court, they slapped contempt on him, and all the contempts added up to a year. And, he had a perfectly legitimate case representing people in the Amazon, I think it was it?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So this is, anyway, it's a huge question about culpability and then liability, but I'm thinking about how you put a price on this. And I know that Delta's going to speak to this, because they can do things when they're put to the fire. I'm thinking about when we had all the problem with acid rain.
Mm-hmm.
They actually brought in limits on coal fires. And I think the sulfur dioxide that was produced was cut hugely back, wasn't it? Am I correct about that?
Yeah.
Acid rain, which because they were forced to. Nobody said you might. Would you like to? There was no voluntary. It was mandated, and I think that's really what we have to do with these people is mandate them, because otherwise, as Jeffrey says, they'll say we're going to do this, and then they rescind it or change their mind, and no, we don't feel like doing that anymore, as though it's something on the menu. Anyway, and
I think you're absolutely, if I can interject, I mean, I think you're absolutely right about that, and there is a need for regulation and mandates and to curb greenhouse gas emissions. That's absolutely a need. But I will say that that's not the role of this particular stream of litigation. I think that it's important to note that these cases are not about stopping greenhouse gas, emissions or stopping the production of fossil fuels. It really is about compensation for harm and holding, these bad actors accountable for the lies and the deception and the fraudulent activities on their part, and to seek justice and accountability for the communities that are being adversely affected. So it really is about compensatory harm, not so much about stopping the flow of the stream of commerce or preventing emissions from continuing. So I think that certainly is the role of government and what we need to see regulatory action move forward and address.
So they almost have to happen concurrently. Otherwise, we're completely scuppered. I mean, if we're going to take a year and a half for these things to roll on, there was some talk in one of the articles today that, it might happen in 2024. I think it was your article, Delta. This, it should come to part 2024. We haven't got the time to wait to 2024. And now they're increasing production, BP. So, I mean, instead of just saying right now, we've got to cut from now and meet these targets while these lawsuits are proceeding, we're going to be like the mole going through the mountain. We're just digging away, and this thing is just getting larger and larger. So, okay, let's go across to Delta. Welcome, Delta, from the Union of Concerned Scientists. So you're in a sort of brand new area of science, climate litigation. So how far have you guys been able to come in your time with being involved with this to link climate events to and increases in global warming back to the cause being fossil fuels?
Yeah, so I'm excited to dig into that. I do want to say one thing to Alyssa's last comment. So what she's talking about are the cases in the US, which you were asking her about. And it's very true, kind of that they're defined in certain ways. But I do want to say that internationally, there is litigation that is about mitigation of emissions. Yep. So we do see cases happening kind of in the international forum that are specifically looking at cutting greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the probably most well-known is the case in the Netherlands that was against Shell when Shell was still headquartered in the Netherlands, which they moved, I think, primarily for legal reasons, but and the courts there did find that they need to cut their emissions. And that they're in appeals process, but the courts did say that even during that appeal process, they need to be reducing their emissions. So just to say that there's a lot of different kinds of cases that are happening and different legal theories that are driving them. And in different jurisdictions and legal systems, you have different cases and you need different evidence and research for those. So just to kind of put that out there. So I guess more specifically to talk about the research. So yeah, I work on what I call litigation relevant research. And to be clear, climate litigation relevant research can take a lot of different forms. So in fact, I worked on 2 publications this past year that helped to outline and prioritize research needs in this really emerging area of work. So broadly, this work helps us to understand how litigators are thinking about scientific input in their work. And we found that there's need for research in the natural sciences, the social sciences, legal analysis, translational work. There's a number of different fields that are required to really inform these discussions in a meaningful way, because climate change is incredibly complex. And the impacts are complex, but are understood and can be understood scientifically. So through that process, we identified nearly 100 specific research questions that legal teams have right now, and that scientists need to engage in to really drive this field. We did further analysis, and we helped to prioritize those areas. And the main areas of work that are needed are around climate attribution science, climate obstruction work, which is what Alyssa was really talking about and what Geoff's book really highlights. And then also research to help better assess emission reduction. So that gets at kind of that other question you had of like, how do the courts grapple with what emission reductions really look like? And there's need for science around that. But to your specific question, I want to talk about how to link climate impacts to kind of events and then to specific industry. So to link climate impacts such as the typhoon that was highlighted in Petroleum Papers to carbon producers themselves, to the oil and gas producers, we need to look at a field of science that's called attribution science. And attribution science, what it does is it helps to answer the question, did climate change play a role in that? So climate attribution has been around for about 2 decades, which is an incredibly new science. That's a very new field, but there's been really important advances that have happened over the last 5 years. Now, with attribution science, and this is how we kind of get at these connections, there's really 2 areas of attribution science. So there's event attribution and there's source attribution. So I want to start with event attribution, and then I'll talk a little bit about source. But with event attribution, that can tell us kind of how climate change has added to the severity of a particular event. So it's about understanding the role of climate change versus natural weather patterns or random climate variability. So these types of studies can tell us how much hotter a heat wave is, or how much greater intensity the downpour during a hurricane might be because of climate change specifically. Attribution science can also help us understand the compound impacts that happen during climate change. So for example, during a hurricane is its dynamics itself are changed because of climate change, but the impacts are also changed because of sea level rise. And through attribution science, we can take these different pieces and understand them all kind of in their individual aspects and understand the role that climate change played in each of those, right? So event attribution helps us understand the role of climate change. And now source attribution science can help us identify the role of specific emission sources. So this gets at some of those corporate questions that you're asking. So this work kind of on the source attribution really started back in 2013 with a publication by Richard Heady, which found that nearly 2/3 of all industrial carbon emissions from the Industrial Revolution onwards can be traced to just 90 fossil fuel and cement producers. So these companies, which we commonly call the carbon majors, include Exxon Mobil, BP, Chevron, Shell, just to name a few, right? And kind of from that data set, we've been able to do a number of other studies that look at climate events that look at a number of different impacts from climate change and can do the attribution study to understand kind of the role of climate change in that, and then look at the role of industry. So some of my colleagues at the Union of Concerned Scientists have published around source attribution, and they have found that these carbon producers contributed to about 42 to 50% of all global temperature rise. So again, this is just less than 100 companies that are responsible for this or who tie to this. We also know that upwards of 32% of global sea level rise is tied to these companies, and that nearly half of all ocean acidification. So again, this is a really new science, but it's emerging rapidly and growing in really exciting ways. And we're starting to kind of get new impacts and understand this at different levels. I think what's amazing about this is we often get caught in thinking of climate change as something that's global, that's abstract, it's hard to address. And this is part of, what we hear and what the industry wants us to think about it. But there you can see through the science that there's clear connections between climate change and specific actors.
That was a very good explanation of the difficulties involved in, you're making headway, but when you have an event like this, for example, Geoff was mentioning in Vancouver that they decided to open a tar sands exploration. I'm not sure what year it was. Already with this knowledge.
Oh, that was in Alberta, yeah.
And the effect on Vancouver has been that they're going to have already, I think, $50 million, I've got it written down, of damages. Yes. Suncor decided to tap the third largest oil reserve on the planet in the 1950s. Now Vancouver faces 50 million in climate damages as a result. So my question is, how far back do you go in terms of linking cause and effect? And then how do you quantify that? How do you quantify it? Because we know that this damage is ongoing.
Right. Yeah. So most of these models that currently exist look at from the Industrial Revolution. So they're starting to look at from when industry started to pollute, right? And when carbon started to be produced on a mass scale. But then the more recent studies break it down kind of based on the same type of research that you're seeing, based on the social science research, the historical archives, to say, okay, from 65, when, we can say with certainty that the industry understood the consequences of their products in this space, what has happened since then? So you can break it down by a number of different timeframes, right? And as the research improves and likely as discovery moves forward, in some of the cases that Alyssa talks about, if that date moves backwards, then you can continue to shift the analysis to address that, to understand what the contributions have been for carbon in that time period. And then you can kind of do the source attribution to understand how that impacts different events. Now, the question that you ask moving forward and what that looks like is really important, and it is a super interdisciplinary space to think about, right? Because climate change, the events that we have today are only happening because industry, or maybe not only, but are happening partially because industry failed to act back in the 50s when Geoff highlights that industry knew, right? In those moments, if they started to say, oof, like this is not a product that we can morally sell, and started to phase out, then the world that we look in would look very different. So it's not as simple as saying, okay, what percentage of these impacts are caused from your carbon produced? There's also the impacts of how the world might have looked differently if you didn't have all this greenwashing, if you weren't producing this obstruction of the science, if you weren't putting out all these campaigns to create disinformation and prevent policies from happening. So those all need to start to be factored into that conversation as well.
There's going to be an awful lot of lawyers being involved in this for a long time to come. So what about taking countries now? We've talked about, Alyssa talked about certain climate action cases in the United States by locales and states. What about the country like the Philippines, where you said there's actually human rights issues now part of the equation? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so in the international cases, at least that I've been involved with, the majority of them are actually based around human rights law. And that's the lens that folks are looking at climate change. In the Philippines, the case here, which is really interesting, and again, ties really well into Geoff's work, but there was a Commission of Human Rights of the Philippines, and they conducted an inquiry into the human rights impacts of climate change in the Philippines, really seeking to hold these companies, these carbon majors, accountable for contributing to global emissions of greenhouse gases and the resulting impacts. So that commission, again, this was an inquiry, so they basically put out a report at the end of it, but they were looking at, what are the possibilities for holding these companies accountable? And what they found was that the science was strong enough to link individual companies, groups of companies, to the harms that we're seeing in the Philippines. So I think the report came out last year. Is about a 7-year process of studying this. And that's partially because it was the first of its kind to really examine the role of these oil and gas companies in climate-related human rights violations in this way. And ultimately, they found that the 47 investor-owned corporations that they were specifically looking at, which include Shell, include ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP, Total, so not just kind of the US and UK based, or I guess Total's in France, but they found that they can be legally and morally liable for human rights harms to Filipinos resulting from climate change. They also found that the relevant criminal intent may exist to hold companies accountable under civil and criminal law. So this goes beyond a lot of the cases that we've seen. And that in light of certain circumstances, that there's potential for legal avenues looking at, you know, the role that these companies played in obstruction and climate denial and how that led to the impacts that we have today. One of the things that I think was really powerful in this report, there's a lot, it's something that's really interesting to read through and look at their findings. But they really talk about kind of the failure to act. So this point that we were just addressing, and they understood that by no later than 1965, these companies understood the harms and the risks of their products. And there's this really powerful line from the findings of the commission that say that these efforts to obstruct climate action were driven not by ignorance, but by greed. So it's a very clear kind of lens on what was happening, right? They can't say they didn't know. This was about profits and this was driven by greed.
And can I say something about the Philippines? Because I went to the Philippines when that inquiry was just getting started. And while I was there, I traveled down to Tacloban City, which had been totally destroyed by Typhoon Haiyan in 2013. It was one of the most powerful storms in human history. And when I was there, I met a woman my age named Joanna, and most of her close family members were killed during that typhoon. And we sat in a coffee shop, and she pointed to a water line high up on the ceiling and said, that's how high the storm surge had been when Typhoon Haiyan came through. And so Joanna wasn't someone who, before the hurricane, ever really thought much about climate change or activism at all. But when environmental groups started coming to Tacloban, she began to learn more and more about the science of climate change, how it had contributed to disasters like Typhoon Haiyan. And then after documents started being released about what oil companies knew about climate change, she saw that in some of these companies' internal communications, they had actually seemed to predict tropical storms getting worse as a result of burning their products. And so now, if you can only imagine this woman, Joanna, she's experienced one of the worst events you could possibly imagine linked to climate change. Now she's starting to realize that inside the research labs of companies like Shell and Exxon, they had known that disasters like this were possible. And instead of transitioning their business models, they did everything they could to increase the climate impact of what they were pulling out of the ground. And so just speaking for myself, that's really when all of this kind of became real to me, and what wasn't just, you know, an abstract legal or scientific discussion. There are real human lives that are being affected by decisions made in the corporate boardrooms of oil companies. And Joanna's story is just one out of millions and millions across the entire planet.
Yeah, it's very well documented in the book, your conversations about her, what happened to her. We've got a lot of questions coming in, and we ought to take some of them. I don't know if you want to field this, Delta. Does your research suggest that the fossil fuel companies shared their internal predictions of impacts with other oil industry companies?
Yeah, so I can talk about this a little bit, and I'm sure Geoff can touch on it more. I think what's important to understand is that these companies are part of industrial groups, right, and lobbying groups. So through the American Petroleum Institute, through API, that's how, I guess, there's an understanding of the larger knowledge through the industry, because these documents were shared through this lobbying group. So yeah, there was shared knowledge that exists between the groups. And Geoff, I don't know if you want to talk about that more.
Well, that actually led to my publisher and I deciding to have the word conspiracy in the title of my book. And people have asked me since the book came out, can you really call this a conspiracy, or is it responsible to use that word given how many crazy conspiracies are out there these days? But what we can see going through the industry's own documents is that in the 60s, trade associations like the American Petroleum Institute, they wrote reports about climate change, disseminated those to their member companies. And then these same trade associations helped come up with communication strategies for making people doubt climate change was real. And so in that very real sense, these top oil companies did conspire together to bury their own scientific knowledge.
And that is certainly the basis of some of the claims that we're starting to see in these cases. I think the Boulder lawsuit was the first suit to include a conspiracy claim. And more recently with the RICO, the racketeering case that was brought by the Puerto Rican communities, which I don't know, Jeffrey, as you're talking about, the hurricane or the typhoon in Philippines, I mean, reading through the Puerto Rican complaint, I mean, the stories and the impacts and the harm that the suffering that went on in Puerto Rico in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria and the other hurricane that followed shortly after, it was devastating and resulted, I think, in probably close to 4,000 deaths as well. So I think, in terms of putting a price tag on all of this, it's a question that you asked earlier on, Mary. I mean, it's almost impossible to do it. There are ways to go about doing it, and courts are adept at calculating these kinds of damages. But the harm is severe and it's widespread, and it's only going to get worse.
That term, we've actually got the link to that article The Guardian did on climate racketeering. That strikes everybody as a strange word to use. You don't think of racketeering. Why is it racketeering? Because there were so many people involved in fixing the situation, or not fixing? I mean, rigging rather than fixing, solving.
Well, the federal RICO statute came about as a response to and a means to address what was going on with the mafia, very specifically. And it's now been used, I think, against, in this type of litigation, it was used against the tobacco industry. It's been used against the opioid industry and big pharma. And now I think it rightly so that people are looking at this as, a conspiracy. The fact that the American, Petroleum Institute was funding research back in the late 1960s that they then distributed to their members, that they were coming together on a regular basis and coming up with, well, how do we deal with this? What's the response going to be? What does this look like in practice? How do we create the doubt and uncertainty in the minds of Americans? So they're not totally, feel the vitriol when they go to the gas pump. I mean, it was all done with, extraordinary intention, and it was done very effectively and successfully. And, again, the PR firms were instrumental in this, right? I mean, they were selling doubt, they were selling deception, they were selling denial on the part of the industry. And they did it very effectively.
Somebody's written a comment rather than a question, or maybe you can address it. Quote, caused by greed, which we just use that expression. We have a culture where individuals can regard themselves as blameless while hiding behind a corporation to whom all liabilities are meant to adhere. What activism will succeed in this light? I kind of think of it as the other way around myself.
Yeah. So one of the things that starts to get at that a little bit, right, is looking at this at the same lens, but understanding that these corporations are individuals, right? And there's individuals that are involved in them. And that's something that you see in one of the latest cases. So Client Earth, as a shareholder and with other shareholders, filed a lawsuit against Shell Oil just a day or two ago, which alleges that the 11 members of Shell's board are mismanaging the climate risk and breaching company law by failing to implement energy transition strategies that really align with Paris. But what's important about this case is it's the first case that is coming against individual board members, right? So those corporate representatives as individuals are being questioned about their decisions and are potentially facing legal consequences.
I should note that when the oil companies attempt to respond to these lawsuits, they do everything possible to make climate change seem as abstract and removed from any specific individual or company as possible. There was one line from a lawyer responding to one of these liability lawsuits, and he said something to the effect of, a molecule of carbon travels around the entire planet. You can't possibly trace this to any one person. And so it's in the best interests of the industry to make us all feel that we're equally responsible for this climate emergency, instead of seeing the emergency correctly as a series of opportunities that were deliberately sabotaged by a small handful of companies whose executives have names and addresses and boardrooms that they sit in.
This is a bit specific, this question. I don't know if anyone can address it, but somebody's asked, what have you found out about the ways in which the fossil fuel companies infiltrated universities and the college curricula? That's a bit specific, might be tricky.
Yeah,
okay.
So I can just very briefly talk on that. And I think Geoff, in your book, you talk a little bit about the Stanford and some of the money that went through there, if I'm right. But there's certain institutions that and research groups at institutions that have been very much affiliated with fossil fuel. One of the things, I wish I had the stats right in front of me, but there was an article that came out, I believe in Nature, but just in November it was published. And it looked at the role, and this is specifically trying to understand methane, and they looked at the role the fossil fuel industry played in funding research around methane and what the outcomes of that research were. And they see for scientific studies that were done that were funded by industry, they're all much more favorable to industry versus studies that have independent funding that are coming to them. So I think more and more they're starting to see, and people are starting to pull that apart and really think about where the funding is coming from and what the results of that science are, which is critical. And it's important to understand what the assumptions are that are being made in these scientific studies, to especially as we see areas where I think the industry really wants to use science to manipulate and rethink how we define some key terms in this area. So one of the things that I'm real nervous about, and that some colleagues at the Union of Concerned Scientists are tracking, is the way that industry defines scope 3, which is one kind of measure of emissions, which gets kind of nerdy to get into it. But basically, it's the largest portion of emissions, and legal cases have shown that the companies should be held legally responsible for these emissions. And now Exxon is essentially trying to start a campaign to change the definition of scope 3 so that the legal findings have different meanings. And we need to be really aware of that and really critical as we're in these spaces.
Yeah. I also think, go ahead.
Oh, and I would just say briefly, the industry doesn't just fund attacks on science. It funds an entire political and social worldview. So if you look at the organizations that Koch Industries has funded, these are quite far-right organizations that are in some cases calling for the abolition of government and pushing this anti-regulatory celebration of individual entrepreneurial spirit that cannot flourish with any sort of government regulations or collective action, and that's been a deliberate attempt by industry to sort of enshrine its attacks against science as being not only common sense but being morally and politically right, and we're still living in that world.
I think you raised an interesting point about who's investing and in what. So when people are thinking about how they can make their voice heard, if you want to make enough fuss, you can find that art galleries or ballet companies or masterpiece theatre even. If you express your dissatisfaction or say, I'm divesting from you because of this, those things actually do have trickle-on effects. Eventually, people will, I think in London, the ballet, I'm not sure if it's the National Ballet, but anyway, they've recently severed links with the petroleum industry, which takes quite a lot of bravery to do that. But it means that they're going to be speaking and walking with their conscience, And I think it goes back to this thing. You can't keep passing the buck and saying, oh, it's some amorphous group of people. It isn't. It's individuals that make these decisions. So I think we can all be empowered and not so depressed by all this. Delta, you wrote a very upbeat, if that's not the right word to use, but optimistic piece, 3 predictions for climate litigation in 2023. So maybe you could speak a little bit about that. We've actually got a link to that article as well.
Yeah, I do want to say to the other comment that you were making, there's a lot of folks now that are looking at the financial institutions that play a role in funding these projects and how you can divest your money from that, what that looks like. And there's folks at UCS who are working on that. So if that's something you're interested in, please reach out. The article that I wrote, tried to summarize kind of 3 areas that I'm hoping to see change or predicting to see movement in over the next year. The first is that I do believe that, Exxon, BP, Shell, Chevron, these groups and the companies that are involved in the U.S. litigation, that communities across the nation will start to see their day in court. And as Alyssa mentioned, there's been these cases have been tied up in these jurisdictional battles, and we are starting to see movement in some of them. And if the industry continues to use, their coffers to push on these jurisdictional battles, there is space for the Biden administration to step in and to. So I am hopeful that this year we're going to see movement there. I also think that this year we're going to see new and exciting legal approaches to accountability happening across the globe. And so the case that we talked about with Shell and the shareholders is one example of that. But I think that we're going to see innovative greenwashing lawsuits that really dig into some of the environmental claims and the net zero statements of these industries, and that it'll expand beyond just the fossil fuel industries, right? Understanding the role that clothing companies and the auto industry and agribusiness, in addition to big oil, have played in this. I also think we'll see more cases against corporations. So globally, the majority of the cases have been against governments. And I think we're going to see a lot more around corporate actors that are happening kind of across the world. And part of that, that I think will shift that landscape is this exciting moment that we're at, where the International Court of Justice is preparing to vote on an advisory opinion on climate change. And this advisory opinion isn't a lawsuit in itself, but it could shape how state courts need to look at climate change and understand it in terms of human rights. And this is something that's been led by the nation of Vanuatu, and really has the potential to uplift communities and uplift the connection between human rights and climate change. So that's something that has a lot of hope and potential in it. Also, importantly to me, I also think that we're going to see continued advances in the science. So we're going to be able to strengthen existing cases with new science, but also really inform new litigation as new science is emerging into this field. And again, this is an incredibly new area of research, and there's a lot of excitement for it. And there's a lot of ways for experts and scientists to get involved, to be working in this space. If you're an expert or a scientist and you're interested in this, please reach out to me and please sign up for the Science Hub, for our newsletter, if you just want to hear kind of what's happening in the realm of science and climate litigation. But now we've identified the gaps. We have kind of clear mandates, or I guess clear paths forward for doing some of this research. And I'm hopeful for some meaningful progress.
Well, while you're speaking of that, I was always wondering, long before anybody else was willing to admit climate change was going on, the insurance companies were very, very clear on upping your policy, making sure you didn't live too close to the coast, And now, following the Florida situation that we had, I'm wondering when this point is going to come, this tipping point, when the insurance companies say, look, we're going to have to go after the oil companies because they caused this. That's what I'm hoping is going to be this perfect triangle where the insurers go after that, because you can't keep upping people's premiums. I mean, are people going to go back and rebuild exactly where they had their house wiped out before? I mean, some people do, some people can't. So I see that as a perfect, I hate to use the word perfect storm, but hopefully that might have some kind of body weight that might. Did anyone got any, Geoff, have you got any feelings on that?
Yeah, absolutely. The insurance industry is really interested in climate change and has been for a long time, and needs to understand it for its business to be able to operate. And I think, just to make a bigger point about all of the various legal actions that Delta and Alyssa are describing, you don't necessarily need one of these to succeed right now in the short term to have real world impacts. And what all of these legal actions are doing around the world is they're delegitimizing the ability of the fossil fuel industry to operate with the support of society. And so the more institutions you have cutting ties with the industry, the more legal efforts you have targeting the industry, the more you have the public waking up to the extent to which they've been lied to about this issue for years and years. That takes away a lot of the political cover that has shielded the industry from the types of regulations that would actually force it to make the changes we need to see. And in fact, that's the scenario that the oil and gas industry has been planning for and trying to stop for the last 40, 50, 60 years. And so I think we're at a really interesting moment where you could see a collapse in public opinion similar to what we saw around the tobacco companies.
Well, I hope you're right. And I am very grateful that people like you are all working so diligently on this in all your different spheres, because it's the only way we're really going to make any kind of progress. The lobbying thing still worries me enormously, I have to say. The fact that they still wield such influence with politicians. I wish we could stop that, because they just seem to palm everything and cushion their way and their access. But there we are. I guess you've left us with lots of good things to think about and ways to act by buying Geoff's book, contacting Union of Concerned Scientists, contacting the Centre for Climate Integrity. All of these things are helping the battle. Okay, well, I'd like to thank Geoff Dembicki for his book, also Alyssa, Johl, and Delta Merner for their tireless work in fighting this injustice, building the scientific case, and helping get the oil companies to respond in court. Cambridge Forum is made possible through the generosity of Herbert and Dorothy Vetter, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, Laura Institute, the Cambridge Community Foundation, and of course you. So if you've got any spare change, feel free to donate it to us via the website. You can also sign up for all the updates for free, www.cambridgeforum.org. There you'll find a podcast of this shortly, also video links to all our past programs and access to our digitized archives. We produce a weekly NPR broadcast of this forum, and with the help of GBH Forum Network, you'll be able to view a video of this show within the next couple of weeks on YouTube. So tell your friends, view it again, spread it around. That's how things get done. Thanks very much for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you on the 28th. And dare I say, happy Valentine's Day. Thank you. Bye-bye.